She was crippled. She was quiet. She made their coffee every morning with a damaged hand and said nothing when they laughed. He was her husband, and he had absolutely no idea. His mistress called her the barista. His colleagues looked through her like glass. Every single morning, Stellan Voss walked past the woman in the wheelchair, took the coffee she made him, and went back to his corner office to plan his next move, completely unaware that the most powerful person inside Meridian Acquisitions Group was not the CEO sitting on the 52nd floor. It was the woman he had stopped holding doors for. It was the woman his mistress mocked in front of a full corridor of colleagues. It was his wife. What nobody in that building knew, what Stellan himself had never once bothered to find out, was that Corinthia Voss was not just a woman in a wheelchair pushing through each day on resilience and grace. She was Corinthia Devereux Ashford, sole heir to the Ashford Capital Group, a $4.7 billion private equity empire. The secret billionaire CEO who had rolled into Meridian Acquisitions not as a victim, not as a wife, but as a hunter. And every single person on that floor was already inside her trap without knowing it. She had not married Stellan by accident. She had not taken that barista position by accident. Nothing Corinthia Ashford did was ever by accident. And now, with 60 days on her clock, a legal case already built, a board already mobilized, and a husband who had just pressed the elevator door close button directly into her face on his very first morning. The only question left was not whether karma was coming. The only question was, how bad would it hurt? Would a man who mocked his crippled wife over coffee survive the moment she revealed who she really was? Would a mistress who laughed at orthopedic shoes still be laughing when the woman wearing them signed the papers that ended her career? And what happens when the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone decided wasn't worth noticing? Stay right here. Because this story will answer every single one of those questions, and the answers will absolutely destroy you. The morning Stellan Voss walked into Meridian Tower for his first day as Senior Vice President of Operations. He did not hold the elevator for the woman in the wheelchair behind him. He let the doors close. He never looked back. That was his first mistake, and it would not be his last, but it would be the one she remembered most precisely, most personally. The one she would return to when the time came to make sure justice arrived with perfect symmetry. The lobby of Meridian Acquisitions Group smelled like money. Cold marble floors the color of bone. Fresh white lilies arranged in tall, severe vases that nobody had ever stopped to smell. The kind of silence that only expensive buildings could afford, the silence of people who had long ago learned to move quietly around power, to lower their voices near it, to orbit it without touching it. Stellan moved through it like a man who had been waiting his entire life to belong inside exactly this kind of silence. He was 41 years old, and he was, by every visible measure, the picture of earned success. 6'2", shoulders that filled a jacket with authority, a jaw that looked like it had been architecturally designed for boardroom confrontations. His Brioni suit was charcoal gray, 1,200 threads per inch, custom fitted at a tailor on West 57th Street 3 days ago, the receipt still sitting on his home office desk like a small monument to arrival. He had spent 12 years inside the grinding machinery of mid-level finance, 12 years of watching lesser men get promoted faster, 12 years of smiling at people he despised, 12 years of telling himself that patience was not weakness, that his moment was simply being assembled somewhere ahead of him. And today, finally, irrevocably, it had arrived. Senior Vice President of Operations, Meridian Acquisitions Group. The most ruthless, most profitable private equity firm on the entire East Coast, a firm whose name alone caused smaller companies to restructure in self-defense. He allowed himself one slow, deeply private smile at his own reflection in the elevator doors. He did not notice the woman behind him, or rather, he noticed her the way a man like Stellan noticed anything that registered below his current altitude. A peripheral flicker, a shape that did not require processing, a motorized wheelchair, a gray cardigan, a woman whose entire visible existence communicated nothing that interested him. She was navigating the revolving door with practiced, unhurried patience, her right hand steady on the joystick, her left hand resting in her lap at the slight inward angle that had become its permanent resting position since the nerve damage 6 years ago. The accident had rearranged certain things in her body. It had rearranged nothing in her mind. Her dark hair was pulled back simply. Her face was calm, unreadable, and quietly, devastatingly attentive to everything around her: the security guard who looked away, the receptionist who didn't look up, the man in the Brioni suit whose eyes found her reflection in the closing elevator doors and whose right hand moved, deliberately, to press door close. The doors sealed. Corinthia Devereux Ashford watched the floor numbers climb above her without changing her expression. She had expected this. She had, in fact, been counting on men like Stellan to be exactly who they were, because men who close doors on people in wheelchairs are men who close doors on a great many things they cannot afford to lose. She pressed the call button. She waited. She rode the next elevator alone to the 34th floor, and in the 40 seconds of that ride, her phone buzzed once in her lap. The text was from a contact stored only as R, her chief legal officer, Fernsby Keel, who used the initial on Corinthia's personal device as a precaution they had maintained since the beginning of this operation. The message read, "Board has approved Phase 2. You have 60 days. Corinthia read it once, typed back 3 words. "I won't need them." She was not being arrogant. She was being accurate. She had been inside Meridian's orbit for nearly 5 months before today, watching its financials, mapping its internal culture, identifying the specific fracture lines where corruption had settled in like damp rot behind good paint. She knew this building better than most people who worked in it. She knew its secrets better than the people keeping them. What the world knew about Corinthia Ashford, at least the small sliver of the world that paid attention to private equity at that level, was that she was the only child of Whitmore Ashford, founder of Ashford Capital Group, a man who had built a $4.7 billion empire in such deliberate obscurity that his own name had never once appeared on a magazine cover. Whitmore had believed with almost religious conviction that visible wealth was a form of weakness, that the moment a person began performing their power, they had already begun losing it. He had raised Corinthia inside that philosophy the way other fathers raised daughters inside faith. He had taught her that the most effective way to understand a company was to enter it as a nobody, to sit at the lowest possible position, to watch how people behaved when they believed no one important was watching. She had spent her 20s doing exactly that, cycling through companies as an assistant, an analyst, a coordinator, a contractor, absorbing institutional culture from the inside while her legal team assessed acquisition value from the outside. It was how she had caught 3 companies mid-fraud before anyone else saw it coming. It was how she had tripled Ashford Capital's portfolio in 7 years. And it was how she had identified Meridian Acquisitions, not just as a financial target, but as a company rotting from the inside in ways that required a specific kind of evidence, gathered in a specific kind of proximity, to bring it down cleanly and completely. The car accident that left her with permanent nerve damage to her left hand and partial mobility limitations had happened during one of those operations, a late-night drive back from a covert site visit to a manufacturing facility she was evaluating. The truck that hit her had run a red light. The driver had been uninsured. The injury had required 3 surgeries, 18 months of rehabilitation, and a complete recalibration of her physical life. It had not required her to stop working. She had approved 2 acquisitions from a hospital bed. She did not speak about the accident. She did not perform suffering. She had simply adapted with the same precise efficiency she applied to everything and continued. The elevator opened on 34. Corinthia rolled out into the corridor, and Meridian Acquisition spread before her, glass offices, humming monitors, the low-frequency tension of a floor full of people performing competence at various levels of authenticity. She moved through it slowly, cataloging. She noted which conference rooms had air return vents running toward the east wing. She noted the layout of the hospitality alcove near the far corridor. She noted 3 different employees who, from body language alone, showed the specific ground-down exhaustion of people who had been mistreated systematically and had stopped expecting anything different. Near the copy station, a young intern was losing a battle with a stack of folders. He lurched sideways to clear her path, nearly dropping everything. She looked at him with steady, unhurried eyes. "Jasper," she said. He blinked. "Yeah, yes." "How did your lanyard," she said, nodding at the ID badge swinging against his chest. "Third day," his eyes went wide. "How did you know it was the third?" "First day, people hold their badges like they're afraid to lose them," she said evenly. "Second day, they forget they're wearing them. Third day, a brief glance at the slightly bent clip. They've already dropped it once." Jasper laughed, short, surprised, genuine. "That's, yeah, elevator on 2 yesterday morning." "Gets easier," she said. Then she continued down the corridor, unhurried, invisible to everyone who thought they mattered. Jasper watched her go with a small frown he couldn't fully explain. The frown of someone who has just spoken to a person who knew slightly more than they should, who paid attention in a way that felt different from ordinary attention, who looked at a 34th floor corridor the way a chess player looks at a board rather than the way an employee looks at a workplace. He filed the feeling away without knowing what to do with it. He would remember it later, when everything came apart. He would think back to this exact moment in the corridor and understand that the ending had already been written before any of them knew the story had begun. The hospitality corner appeared on the 34th floor during the 3rd week of October, quietly, the way all the most consequential things arrive. Without announcement, without ceremony, fitted so naturally into the existing texture of the floor that most people simply accepted it as something that had always been there. It occupied a widened alcove near the East Wing corridor, a sleek espresso machine, a selection of single-origin beans, oat and almond milk in a small refrigerated cabinet, a ceramic tile counter that someone had clearly spent actual money on. A hand-lettered card on the counter read complimentary. "Enjoy." The woman who staffed it arrived each morning before 7, set up the station with quiet efficiency, and served coffee until 10 without calling attention to herself in any way that the floor's senior staff would register as significant. Her name, as far as the 34th floor was concerned, was simply Corinthia, the coffee lady, the woman in the wheelchair. Not unkind descriptions, just the descriptions of people who had decided, without deliberating over the decision, that she existed in a category of person that didn't require further investigation. They were wrong on a scale that would eventually make some of them physically ill to contemplate. The espresso machine Corinthia had selected for the station was a La Marzocca Linea, a commercial-grade unit that cost $11,000 and produced coffee of a quality that was quietly, unmistakably superior to anything else on the floor. She had expensed it through the facility's contractor. Nobody had questioned it, because nobody above a certain level of seniority looked at facilities' invoices, and everyone below that level had learned not to ask questions about line items they hadn't created. The coffee was excellent. People noticed the coffee. Nobody thought about where it had come from or why it was that good. Corinthia had also, during the station's installation, had the unused conference room directly adjacent to the East Wing alcove fitted with a sound capture system. Small, legally disclosed in the building's updated facilities documentation, routed through the same shell company that held the facility's contract. The conference room shared a wall with Stellan's office. The air return vent that ran between them carried sound with an intimacy that an open door could not have improved upon. She had identified this architectural feature from the building's original engineering schematics 3 weeks before she ever set foot on the floor. She had been listening since day 4. By week 3, she had heard enough to end careers. She had not yet moved. She was still building, layering evidence with the same methodical patience her father had spent 30 years trying to teach her, and that she had only truly understood the morning. She sat beside his hospital bed and watched him explain, in a voice already thinning toward absence, that the difference between a good decision and a great one was almost always timing. "Don't swing early, Corey," he had said, his hand loose in hers, the monitors soft and steady beside them. "Let them walk all the way in." She had held his hand until it went still. She had flown back from the hospital to close an acquisition by 4 o'clock the same afternoon because that was what he would have told her to do, and because grief, like everything else, had to wait for the right moment to be fully felt. That had been 3 years ago. She had not fully felt it yet. She suspected she was saving it for somewhere private, somewhere quiet, a room she hadn't built yet, a morning she hadn't reached. On a Thursday in the 4th week, Stellan arrived at the coffee station with Priya Lund. Priya was 34 years old and had cultivated, with genuine artistry, the specific aesthetic of a woman who required no cultivation. As though beauty and authority and a certain devastating social confidence had simply arrived in her fully formed, without effort, without cost, without the 3 hours of preparation that actually preceded every public appearance. She was director of strategy at Meridian, a title she had reached through a combination of real intelligence and a complete willingness to climb using whatever handholds presented themselves. Her relationship with Stellan was the worst-kept secret on 34. They didn't hide it so much as decline to confirm it, which in a floor full of people who had learned not to ask questions about things above their pay grade, amounted to the same thing. She walked beside Stellan with the unhurried ease of someone who believed the corridor existed specifically to frame her entrance. Corinthia looked up from the espresso machine as they approached. Her expression was pleasant, open, and entirely unrevealing. Stellan's eyes moved across her without pausing. "Double-shot Americano," he said. "Hot this time. Last Tuesday whoever did this had it lukewarm." "That wasn't me," Corinthia said pleasantly. "I started Wednesday." He looked at her then briefly, the way a man looks at a person he is speaking to only because speaking at them directly produces faster results than speaking into the air. "Whatever. Hot. Please." Priya leaned one hip against the counter, examined the tips of her nails and said, without adjusting her volume for privacy, "Is this genuinely what the 34 hospitality budget is being directed toward? A barista?" She made the word do something unpleasant in her mouth, turned it over like something she'd found on the bottom of a shoe. Corinthia said nothing. She began pulling the espresso shot with a steady, unhurried hand. Priya turned to Stellan, warming to her material. "She's even wearing orthopedic shoes. Look." A small, bright, privately amused laugh. The laugh of a woman performing contempt for an audience of one, entirely confident the subject of the performance couldn't reach her. Corinthia set the Americano on the counter. Steady hand. Perfect temperature. "Your drink," she said. Stellan picked it up without making eye contact and turned back to Priya mid-sentence, already talking about a presentation, already somewhere else entirely. Priya followed, still smiling, one last glance thrown over her shoulder at Corinthia, the way one throws a glance at a store display, momentarily clocked, immediately forgotten. Neither of them said thank you. From 3 feet away, a young associate named Bethel Crane had watched the entire exchange over the rim of her coffee cup, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to witness cruelty quietly, because making noise about it has never once changed anything. Bethel was 26, genuinely talented with numbers in a way that her 2 passed-over promotions had failed to reward, and had taken to spending her mornings near the coffee station less for the coffee than for the small, steadying experience of being in the presence of someone who didn't make her feel like a problem to be managed. After Stellan and Priya disappeared around the corridor, Bethel looked at Corinthia. "I'm sorry about that," she said quietly. Corinthia looked at her, and this was the look that Bethel would describe later to anyone who asked, as the moment she should have understood that nothing here was what it appeared to be. Not wounded, not resigned, not the look of a woman absorbing a small daily humiliation and storing it somewhere dark. Something else entirely. The look of someone watching a chess piece walk with great confidence directly into a position from which there was no recovery. "Don't be," Corinthia said simply. She tilted her head with something almost like warmth. "Would you like a cortado, Bethel?" Bethel blinked. She had been coming to this station for 11 days. She was fairly certain she had never told Corinthia her name. She opened her mouth, closed it. "How did you know my—" "You signed for a delivery on Monday," Corinthia said, nodding toward the supply cabinet. The clipboard was on the counter. Bethel looked at the cabinet. She had signed for that delivery. She remembered it now. She accepted the cortado, said thank you, and walked back to her desk with the low-grade disquiet of a woman who cannot identify exactly what is wrong, but is increasingly certain that something is. That afternoon, leaving on the elevator, Bethel noticed something she could not explain and could not dismiss. The cleaning woman who worked the East Corridor, a quiet woman in her 50s named Hessa, who had been on this floor for at least 2 years, and who Bethel had never heard exchange more than functional pleasantries with anyone, paused in the middle of wiping down a door handle as Corinthia's wheelchair rolled past at the end of the day. The pause was barely a second. What followed was less than that. A micronod. Not the nod of strangers performing basic social acknowledgement. The nod of people who know each other's real names. Bethel stood very still in the elevator doorway until the doors nudged her forward. She stepped in. The doors closed. She stared at the floor numbers descending and thought about a woman who somehow knew her name from a clipboard she had barely glanced at, who received a private nod from a cleaning woman 2 years into the job, who looked at cruelty the way a surgeon looks at a scheduled procedure. Not emotional, not urgent, already planned. She thought about all of it on the train home. She thought about it in bed that night. And in the morning, for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate, she arrived at the coffee station 10 minutes earlier than usual and stayed 15 minutes longer than she needed to. She was, without knowing it yet, choosing a side. There are marriages that begin in love and decay into arrangement. There are marriages that begin in arrangement and quietly, unexpectedly soften into something resembling love. And then there are marriages like Stellan and Corinthia's, which began in calculation, proceeded in performance, and existed, at every moment, at 2 entirely different altitudes, with only one of the 2 people involved aware of the difference. Stellan had met Corinthia at the Hargrove Foundation Gala, an annual charity event on the Upper East Side, attended by the kind of people who donated generously and were photographed doing it. Corinthia had attended as a volunteer coordinator, wearing a plain black dress and a staff lanyard, directing guests to their tables with quiet efficiency. She had not been in her wheelchair that evening. She used a cane on better days when the nerve signals cooperated, and that night had been a better night. Stellan had found her near the bar, and had found her interesting in the specific way that men like Stellan find quietly intelligent women interesting. As a puzzle with a pleasant exterior, worth a few hours of engagement before the evening required him elsewhere. What he had not known, and would not know for another 4 months, was that Corinthia had been watching him for considerably longer. She had first identified Stellan Voss 9 months earlier, in a risk analysis document prepared by her research team as part of a comprehensive assessment of Meridian Acquisitions Group. He had appeared as a mid-level candidate for the SVP role, ambitious, well-networked, and according to her team's profile, ethically pliable in the specific ways that organizations like Meridian rewarded. He was exactly the kind of man Meridian would promote. He was exactly the kind of man who would, once inside the right proximity to power, say things he should not say in rooms he believed were safe. She needed someone who would be trusted with information she needed to gather. She needed that someone to be someone whose domestic proximity to her could be legally navigated, whose conversations in shared spaces could be documented within the bounds of spousal disclosure law, which her legal team had spent 3 weeks establishing the parameters of before she ever attended the Hargrove Gala. She had not targeted Stellan Voss because she hated him. At the gala, she had not yet had a reason to. She had targeted him because he fit a profile, because the timing aligned, and because Whitmore Ashford had taught her that the cleanest operations were the ones that turned the opposition's own momentum against them, that the most efficient way to take something apart was to let it believe, right up until the final moment, that it was still being assembled. They had dated for 4 months. He had been charming in the rehearsed, high-functioning way of men who had spent years learning which version of themselves produced the best results in any given audience. She had been attentive, warm, selectively revealing. She had let him discover her intelligence gradually, in measured doses like a controlled pour. She told him she worked in investment consulting. She told him she was semi-retired following the accident. She told him she had family money modest, nothing dramatic. He had believed all of it with the comfortable ease of a man who does not interrogate information that confirms what he already wants to think. When she finally told him who she was, one quiet dinner, a glass of wine, her voice entirely even, he had gone very still. She watched the calculations happen behind his eyes in real time, as transparent as code running on a visible screen. He had proposed 6 days later over dinner at a restaurant he had booked 3 days after she told him. At a table he had specifically requested near the window, with a ring that was beautiful and expensive, and selected with the focused efficiency of a man executing a strategic acquisition. She had accepted. She had accepted with a warm smile and a hand she allowed to tremble slightly, because some performances require the other person to believe they have caused something real. They had married quietly, a civil ceremony, 10 people, no announcement. He had described it to colleagues as a practical arrangement, which was accurate in ways he did not intend. He had moved into her Upper East Side townhouse, a 5-story limestone building she owned outright through a residential holding company, and had understood enough to understand that the house was extraordinary, but not enough, apparently, to ask the kind of detailed financial questions that would have revealed the full topography of what he had married into. He had his own money, his own ambition, his own life running in parallel to the marriage like a second current, one that included Priya Lund, whose number had been in his phone under the name P Accounts since 3 months before the wedding. Corinthia had seen the contact name on his unlocked screen on their 4th day of living together. She had said nothing. She had noted it the way she noted everything, as a data point, as a piece of the architecture, as one more reason the exit strategy was not cruelty but correction. She did not hate Stellan. She had evaluated him from the beginning as a mechanism, not a person, a means of accessing information inside a company that was destroying people's lives and careers with the same casual indifference Stellan himself showed to the woman in the wheelchair whose elevator he didn't hold. But there were moments, quiet ones, caught off guard when something in her went briefly, unexpectedly still. Not love, not grief, something more like the recognition of a waste. The recognition that a man who was beneath the performance, not entirely without intelligence or capability, had made a lifetime of choices in the direction of smallness, had chosen, again and again, the version of himself that pressed the door close button. She did not linger in those moments. She returned every time. To the work, the morning after the company dinner, an evening she had attended as Stellan's wife, navigating a rooftop full of Meridian staff, collecting information, and slipping a business card face down into the palm of a man named Davy Ose. She arrived not at the 34th floor coffee station, but at the 42nd floor of a glass building 12 blocks north, where Ashford Capital Group maintained its private offices under a holding company name. Clean rooms, quiet staff. 12 people, each of them exceptional, all of them loyal in the specific way that people become loyal to a leader who is transparent about what she is doing and why. She sat at the head of the conference table. She opened a folder, and she said, with the calm of a woman who had been building toward this moment for the better part of a year, 60 days just became 40. We're accelerating. The quarterly review dinner was held on the rooftop restaurant 2 floors above Meridian's main offices, a space that had been rented for the evening and dressed in the language of corporate celebration. Long tables, good wine. The skyline spread out behind the glass barriers like a reward, like proof that the right people had made the right choices and arrived somewhere worth the view. Stellan had mentioned the dinner to Corinthia 3 days before. In the brief, obligatory way he communicated most domestic information, as a line item, not an invitation. It's a work thing. You don't have to come. He had said it with his eyes on his phone, standing in the kitchen of the townhouse she owned, drinking coffee she had made. He had the specific intonation of a man who hopes an invitation will be declined without requiring him to withdraw it. She had looked up from her book. "I'd love to come," she said pleasantly. His jaw had tightened by a single, barely perceptible degree. "It'll probably run late." "I don't mind late," she said, and returned to her book. She arrived that evening in a black dress, simple, precise, and expensive in the way that only people who have nothing left to prove can afford to be expensive. No jewelry except a single thin gold band on her right hand, her mother's, the one inheritance she wore publicly. Her hair was down. Her wheelchair this evening was a different model than the one she used at the coffee station, sleeker, more architectural, the kind of equipment that cost $40,000 and looked, to anyone paying attention, less like a medical device and more like something designed. People who noticed it the way they noticed well-made watches, with a flicker of involuntary respect that they couldn't always source. Priya saw her from across the roof and leaned slowly toward Stellan's ear. Whatever she said made his jaw do the tight thing again. He crossed the room with the smile he kept for situations that required management. "I didn't think you'd actually come," he said quietly, the smile not reaching anything above his mouth. "You invited me," Corinthia said. "I said you didn't have to. I wanted to meet your colleagues," she said. "I've heard so much." He looked at her for a moment, searching, in the unfocused way of a man who is not accustomed to examining things carefully, for whatever it was in her expression that felt slightly wrong. He didn't find it. He returned to the room, to Priya, to the performance of the evening. Corinthia moved through the dinner slowly, navigating the rooftop with quiet efficiency, making herself available to conversation without seeking it, fielding the brief and slightly uncomfortable interactions of people who were uncertain how to engage with the boss's wife, especially a boss's wife who sat in a wheelchair and offered no clear social script to follow. She was gracious to everyone. She remembered every name. She asked questions that people found afterward they had enjoyed answering more than they expected. And then she found Davy Osai. He was standing at the far end of the bar with the specific stillness of a man occupying a room he no longer felt entitled to occupy, shoulders slightly inward, drink held in both hands, eyes that moved toward the exit periodically, and then returned by some mix of obligation and stubbornness to the middle distance. He was 33 years old, a compliance analyst who had been, until 6 weeks ago, one of the most reliable and meticulous members of the 34 team. He had an almost compulsive commitment to accuracy that his colleagues had variously described as admirable and exhausting, and a personal ethical standard that had made him, in a company quietly built on the careful erosion of such standards, a structural inconvenience. Stellan had identified him as such 8 months ago. He had spent those 8 months engineering a compliance failure, a series of altered timestamps and manipulated documentation trails that pointed, with devastating neatness, directly at Davy. The execution had been clean. The victim had been chosen for his isolation, no powerful mentors, no internal allies, a recent relocation that meant no deep social network outside the office. The formal review was still pending, which meant Davy was still present in the building, still attending mandatory events, still trying to locate the specific moment at which the floor had given way beneath him. Corinthia rolled her wheelchair beside him quietly. "You're Davy," she said. He looked at her, startled by the directness. "Yes, and you're a barista," she said, a dry, even smile, "who is apparently also terrible with numbers." He laughed, sudden, short, the involuntary laugh of a man whose defenses lowered for exactly one unguarded second. "I don't think I've seen you at these things before." "First time," she said. "How long have you been with the company?" What followed was 20 minutes of conversation that Davy would later describe as the strangest and most consequential exchange of his professional life. She asked precise questions and listened to the answers with the focused attention of someone who was not building toward a response but actually hearing what was being said. She did not offer advice. She did not offer sympathy. She offered something more useful, the experience of being taken seriously by someone who had no apparent reason to dismiss him. By the end, she knew everything she needed to confirm what the recordings had already told her. The compliance failure, the altered files, the name of the person who had built the trap. She knew the timestamps that didn't match. She knew the internal communication that had been deleted and that she had, through her team's forensic contractor, already recovered from the building's archived server backup. She also knew that Davy Osai was the kind of person who would, when given the full picture and a protected path forward, tell the truth in front of anyone who needed to hear it. That was the most important thing she had needed to confirm. She reached into the small bag on the back of her chair. She produced a business card, not the soft, generic card she had used to navigate 34 as the coffee station attendant, but the real one. Cream stock, clean type, Corinthia Ashford Voss, Chair Ashford Capital Group. She placed it face down in his hand, her thumb covering the text, her eyes communicating with the economy of someone who does not waste words that this was not a casual gesture. "Keep that," she said quietly. "Don't show it to anyone, but keep it." She rolled away before he could respond, navigating back into the current of the dinner, exchanging a brief, pleasant word with someone near the bar, accepting a sparkling water from a passing server, entirely unremarkable to any casual observer. Davy looked down at the card. He turned it over slowly. He read what it said. He read it again. He stood very still for a long time, surrounded by the noise of the dinner, the clink of glasses, the self-congratulatory warmth of a company that did not yet know what was coming for it. Across the roof, Stellan raised his glass in a toast, laughing at something Priya said. His suit was perfect. His smile was perfect. His future in this moment felt solid and certain and entirely within his control. He had not noticed the card. He had not noticed the 20-minute conversation. He had not, as he would not until it was far too late, noticed anything that happened below the altitude at which he had chosen to live. The dinner ended at 11. Stellan and Priya left together, not flagrantly, but with the specific carelessness of people who have stopped respecting the person they're concealing things from. Corinthia watched them go from near the elevator bank, her expression even and unreadable. She waited until the roof had thinned, until only a few stragglers remained, and then she rode the elevator down alone. In the car home, Stellan sat beside her in silence for several minutes. Then he said, without looking at her, "You talked to Osai." "I met a lot of people tonight," she said. "I noticed you talked specifically to him." She turned to look at him. The car moved through the lit streets outside, the city sliding past the window like a slow film. "He seemed lonely," she said. Stellan put his phone down. When he looked at her, there was something behind his eyes she had not seen before, not understanding, not accusation, not guilt. Something more primitive and less specific. The sensation of standing on a surface that has begun, somewhere beneath the visible layer, to sound hollow. "Corinthia," he said, "I need you to understand that the situation with Osai is sensitive. I need you to stay out of it." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she turned back to the window. "I'm a barista, Stellan," she said softly. "What could I possibly do?" He said nothing. He looked away. He picked his phone back up. And in the quiet of the moving car, with the city scrolling past and her husband's reflection suspended in the dark glass beside her, Corinthia Ashford allowed herself, very briefly, the closest thing to anticipation she ever permitted in the presence of another person. Not excitement, not satisfaction, something quieter and more final, the feeling of a door that has been closing for a very long time approaching, at last, the moment of the latch. The next morning, she did not go to the coffee station. She went to the 42nd floor. She sat at the head of the table. She opened the folder. She looked at the 12 people in the room who had, each of them, spent the better part of a year helping her build something that was not a case file but a reckoning. 60 days, she said, became 40. We're accelerating. Fernsby Keel, sitting to her right, leaned forward and said carefully, "There's one more thing." She slid a photograph across the table. "Someone at Meridian has been asking questions about the barista on 34. Asking who she really is. Since week 1, Corinthia looked at the photograph. The face in it was not Stellan's. It was not Priya's. It was someone she had trusted, someone with access, someone she had believed was exactly where she had placed them. For the first time in the entire story, in all the months of this operation, Corinthia Ashford went completely still, not with fear, with the cold, electrical clarity of a woman who has just discovered that the game she thought she was playing had, at some point she had not identified, acquired a second player. "Long have they known?" she asked. "We don't know," Fernsby said. "But they've been watching since week one." Corinthia picked up the photograph. She studied it for a long time, the face, the context, the implications branching outward in every direction like cracks in ice, each one requiring immediate assessment. Then she set it down. "Then we move," she said quietly. "Tonight." And in the silence that followed, in the clean, climate-controlled quiet of an office that did not exist as far as Meridian Acquisitions was concerned, the next phase of Corinthia Ashford's operation began. Not with anger, not with haste, with the patient, devastating precision of a woman who had been taught by the best person she had ever known to let them walk all the way in, and then close the door.